We last left off at slide 83, where it featured the video of the Gutenberg Press. We're now moving on to a description of the French dual courts. So in the 15th century, Flanders, it was not an independent state, but a region under control of the Duke of Burgundy. The ruler of the fertile east central region of France was still famous for its wines. Duke Philip the Bold was one of the four sons of King John II of France, and in 1369, Philip married Margaret de Maille, which is the daughter of the Count of Flanders and acquired territory in the Netherlands. The dual courts in France art separate divisions of the ordinary courts and the administrative courts. Thereafter, the major source of Burgundian wealth was Bruges, the city that was made Burgundy powerful by a powerful rival of France, which then, as in the Gothic age, was a much smaller kingdom geographically than the modern nation state. The city derived its wealth from world trade, but soon expanded into banking, becoming the financial clearinghouse for all of northern Europe. Bruges so dominated Flanders that the Duke of Burgundy eventually chose to make the city his capital and moved the court from Dijon. Chartreuse and Champenois. Philip the Bold's art enterprise near Dijon is a charter house in English, which is a Carthusian monastery. Philip's generous endowment was, therefore, the sole funding for an ambitious artistic program inspired by the French royal abbey of Saint Denis at the burial site of the French kings. So Klaus Solter, this is one of the artists behind Champagnon, the Chartreuse and Champagnon. So Klaus Solter, this is the Well of Moses in Dijon, France. This was created through the years 1396 through 1406. This was carved limestone. So during this time, we have a lot of royalty paying for a lot of this, religious artwork, particularly in the Flanders area. So we're getting a lot of our wealth from royalty, and certain aspects of the church. So a little bit about Klaus Suter. He's from Haarlem and was in charge of the sculpture program for this piece. Sluter had joined the sculpture workshop as Jean's assistant in 1385. For the portal of the monastery's chapel, Slater's workshop produced statues of the Duke and his wife kneeling before the Virgin and Child. The Well of Moses features statues of Moses and 5 other Testament prophets such as David, Daniel, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Zechariah, ringing a base that once supported a 25-foot tall group of Christ on the cross, mourned by Mary Magdalene, joined perhaps by the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist. Art historians usually describe the Well of Moses as a fons vitae, a fountain of everlasting life, in which the blood of crucified Christ, symbolized by water, flows down to the basin, and anyone who drinks the fountain is redeemed. So let's just go back for a second, and we could see this portion of the Well of Moses. So you could see how detailed a lot of these sculptures are. And you could probably get a little bit of a better view on the second, having a second tab open with the PowerPoint. But, this piece was extremely difficult to make. And, what was mentioned in the description is sometimes whenever these patrons pay for these pieces, they are featured inside of the works. So you'll see that with a couple other things throughout art history. Retable des Champenois, Philip the Bold also commissioned a major altarpiece for the main altar in the Chapel des Chartreuse. A collaborative project between Flemish artists, this altarpiece consisted of large sculptured shrine by Jacques de Barries and a pair of painted exterior panels by Melicoire Bordelem. So this is another piece that has to do with Chartreuse des Champenois. So this is the Retable des Champenois, and this is also in Dijon, France. And this was a wood sculpture, but then the artist collaborated by painting panels on the back side. So this is Melicoire Bordelem. And, so oftentimes whenever you see these altar pieces, they are completely addressed from all sides. So, that's why we're seeing this here. We're seeing the carved version up front and a painted version on the back, which is quite a magnificent work. So altarpieces took the most often the form of polyptychs or hinged multi-panel paintings or multiple panel reliefs. Hinges enabled the clergy to close side wings over the central panel. Because the artist decorated both the exterior and interior of altarpieces, these multi image format provided the opportunity to construct narratives through a sequence of images. So, not only did we see that here in Flanders, but we saw that when we were looking at late medieval, early Renaissance art. So, the borderland panels, these are panels that are a mixture of three-dimensional renditions of landscapes with buildings with solid gold background and flat gold halos for holy figures. Regardless of the position of their heads, despite these lingering medieval pictorial conventions, the altarpiece is an early example of developments that preoccupied European artists through the 15th century, especially the illusionistic depiction of three-dimensional objects on naturalistic representation of landscapes. Manuscript painting. So, in the 15th century, Northern Europe artists built on the achievements of Gothic painters and produced exquisitely refined, illuminated manuscripts. For example, this is an image I have here. This is the Book of Kells, located at Trinity College in Dublin, and this was made in 800 AD. It was influenced by the Northern European manuscript paintings that we are going to view. So, what we were talking about with Gutenberg was the idea of mass producing text, right? So whenever we were getting texts or looking at books from earlier time periods, a lot of them were done in a manuscript fashion. So that means that there was only a very small amount of books on hand. Usually it was only accessible to certain groups of people, mainly like royalty or clergy. So, a lot of the general public wouldn't have access to these kinds of things. But, even though the printmaking press did come out, we're still seeing some of these really important manuscripts that are more delicately made and have less versions of them. So, one of the famous ones that we're going to look at is by the Limburg brothers. And they made a manuscript calendar. So, we're looking at the image of January from Les Tres Riches de Duc de Berry. So, the Duke of Berry is the person that commissioned this work. And, this was made by, three different brothers working together, creating these various panels for the entire calendar year. Here we could see another example. This is October, and you could see these panels are all like intricately detailed. They're on the smaller side. They're 8 inches by they're 8 inches and 7/8 by 5 inches and 3/8. So the size of a book. A smaller one. But the immense amount of detail and what it took to make these things was great. So. The Limburg brothers expanded their exclusionistic capabilities of illumination. They are trained in the Netherlands. They are brothers that moved to Paris no later than 1402 and in between 1405 and their death in 1416, which was most likely from the plague. They worked in Paris and Bourges for Jean, the Duke of Berry, and brother of Philip, the Bold of Burgundy, and Charles V of France. Their illuminated manuscript is one of the most famous in history of the manuscript illumination. They represent 12 months in terms of the associated seasonal tasks, alternating scenes of nobility and peasantry, and among featuring the Duke's relationships with his courtiers and peasants. The manuscripts reinforce the image of the Duke of Berry as a devout man, a cultured bibliophile, lover of books, and a man of the people. All three brothers worked on the manuscripts. Art historians have never been able to ascertain definitively which brother painted each image. So, like I mentioned before, whenever a patron is paying for the work, usually the artist is representing them in that work in some way or form, and in this case, they are helping, kind of promote a positive image of the Duke of Berry. Mary of Burgundy. Limburg's most accomplished successor at the end of the century was an anonymous illustrator known as the Master of Mary of Burgundy. Some scholars identify him as Alexander Benning of Ghent in a painter of Hugo van der Goes. So this is Master of Mary of Burgundy, and you can see, similar to the Limburg brothers, an immense amount of detail and care when it comes to creating these manuscript images, And you could definitely see the influence from the Limburg brothers and how it progresses into these images. Both all the illuminated manuscript makers in this create such stunning work. So the two images we previously looked at are opening the full page, illumination and one of the daily prayers, and the private devotional work of hours that belong to Mary, the last Duchess of Burgundy. She's elegantly dressed, sitting in a private chapel with her pet dog on her lap, reading from a prayer book on the same size of the format as the one in her portrait appears. On the ledge of her left, rosary beads, a tall vase with purple iris dash flowers associated with the Virgin Mary. So now that we're looking at 15th century tempera and oil painting, the discovery of better drawing components in the early 15th century enhanced the capabilities of oils. Rather than employ these oils in the light, flex brush strokes and the tempera technique are encouraged. Artists lay down oils, transparent layers, or glazes over opaque or semi-opaque underlayers. In this manner, painters could build up the deep and subtly radiated tones through repeated glazing. Unlike works in tempera, whose surfaces dry quickly due to water evaporation, oils dry more uniformly and slowly give the artist time to rework areas. So here's a great example of some oil painting done by Robert Champin. This is the Merode Triptych, which is a very famous piece made from 1425 through 1428. This is an oil on wood center panel, and you can see this at the Metropolitan Museum of Art at the New York Cloister Collection. So this piece definitely has a lot of really interesting things going on. So this is the Annunciation of Mary. I'm sorry, not the Visitation for Mary, where Gabriel tells Mary that she's going to be carrying Jesus. These are Mary's relatives, her sister and her brother-in-law, and this is the carpenter Joseph working in his shop. So one thing I want you to notice too is just kind of like this, what the artists during the Renaissance are doing. So one thing is, the story of Jesus happens in Israel, right? Israel's landscape does not necessarily look like this, what they have portrayed here. It's very much reflective of what the landscape and architecture is in Bruges, in the Flanders area, and we saw that a little bit in Italy as well. So sometimes, in order to kind of promote the idea of Catholicism, they would put these the stories of Jesus kind of in their like home settings to make it more relatable. So that's essentially why the figures kind of look like the way they do, and same with the architecture. So that's something that you'll kind of see a lot when it comes to Catholicism and imagery. So the Master of Flamal, Robert Campin, is the leader painter of Tournai, who also worked in a newly popular medium of oil painting. His most famous work in the previous slide has recently been suggested that the triptych is the work of more than one artist, and the wings are a later addition. The question of authorship apart, the painting is one of the many smaller works of this period produced for private patrons and intended for a household prayer. This work depicts the Annunciation, where Mary is being visited by an angel, informing her that the birth of her future child is with Christ. So I want you to take about 10 minutes to work on this writing assignment. So we're going to take a look at these two works. So we just looked at the Merode altarpiece, and then the other piece is one that we looked at earlier, and this is Simone Martini and Lippo Memmi, and this is the Annunciation from the altar of St. Siena Cathedral in Siena. So I want you to compare and contrast these two images. So there's no wrong answers. Take a look at your observations. Try and understand what's happening with these images. They have similar scenes, but the way the artists kind of go about constructing their image and making this work is a bit different. So just take some time, write 250 words, and pause this video as you work on this. So Flemish characteristics. Many works in this period have extremely detailed imagery with a lot of complex narratives. Details in images exemplify figures and landscapes in a very realistic sense. The media used to create the works during this time also draws a comparison to previous works we looked at that were completed in fresco or tempera. The use of oil paint creates a lot of depth and can add to the complexity of imagery. So, one of the most famous people in the Flanders era is Jan van Eyck. He helped create the Ghent altarpiece. This is a famous work that was started by his brother Hubert van Eyck, and he arrived in Bruges to complete it. This piece is one of the largest in the 15th century. So here we can see the Hubert and Jan van Eyck Ghent altarpiece. We're seeing a lot of rich details with the painting work. A lot of different types of complexity with the images. So this is again altarpiece open, and since this was the largest of the 15th century, it is 11 foot by 11 foot 5 by 15 foot 1. So this is really huge, quite impressive to paint. So it took two artists to complete this. Jan van Eyck is really famous for this particular image where, there's just kind of a lot of symbolism going on. This is one of the patrons. This is Giovanni and his wife that commissioned Jan van Eyck to paint this. So this is a scene where, you have Giovanni kind of blessing the fact that his wife is pregnant. They have their dog here and they have different symbolism happening throughout the particular image. One thing that's really unique about the Jan van Eyck image is what he did in this mirror back here. He's one of the first artists known to make a convex image, meaning it's kind of like a dome-shaped painting in the background. So it's a pretty unique work. But I have a big formal analysis of how this image is interpreted. So, again, with art history, we're looking at several things like who commissioned it, what was going on politically at the time, what the artist was trying to say or do. In this case, we're, showing an artist representing a, wealthier family. So in this piece, there is some dispute on how this image is interpreted. According to the traditional interpretation of the painting, Jan recorded the couple taking their marriage vows. Almost every object portrait carries meaning. For example, the little dog symbolizes fidelity. The crowding ornament of the marriage bed at the right is a tiny statue of St. Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth. The bride is not yet pregnant, although she wears a fashionable costume to make her appear so. From the fennel hags, a whisk broom, symbolic of domestic care. The placement of the two figures in the room is meaningful. The woman stands near the bed, well into the room, whereas the man stands near the window, symbolic of the outside world. Many art historians dispute this interpretation because, among other things in the room, Arnolfini and his wife stand as a public reception and not a bedchamber. One scholar has suggested Arnolfini is conferring legal privileges on his wife to conduct business in his absence. Another thinks this may be a memorial portrait to his wife who died during childbirth. In any case, the important aspect of the painting is that the artist functions as a witness to whatever event is taking place. So here we can see a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck, and this is one of the first portraits where we're seeing kind of like a confrontational image, coming from the artist. And this was created in 1433 and in an oil on wood. Man in a Turban is suggested as a self-portrait of Jan van Eyck. The gaze is directly at the viewer. It is the first known Western painted portrait in 1,000 years where the sitter does so. The level, the composed gaze, directed from a true three-quarter head pose, must have impressed viewers deeply. Roger van der Weyden. He was an assistant of Robert Champin, but the young painter's fame soon eclipsed Champin, since he eventually rivaled Jan's. One of the early works in deposition, which was commissioned by the Archer Guild of Leuven, the artist compressed the figures in action into a shallow stage with golden back wall, imitating large sculptured shrines so popular in the 15th century. So this is Roger van der Weyden. So we can see, some really rich details with the painting. A lot of, expressions starting to happen here. Really a lot of differentiation with the figures, rich colored pigments created by the oil paints. So in Flanders, this is kind of how an artist profession would work. A young artist trained under a specific artist and apprenticed with them. They learned how to create basic skills of working with materials such as mixing colors, applying gessos, and varnishes. Once the youth mastered these procedures and learned how to work in the master's traditional manner, they usually spent several years working as a journeyman in various cities, observing and absorbing ideas from other masters. He was then eligible to become a master and could apply for admission to a guild. Fees can be very high, especially if the artist was not a citizen of the same city, as was the case, for example, for Petrus Christus. So this artist, had to, kind of innovate a little bit as far as, his training went. So, here we can see the goldsmith in the shop, but still had a lot of influence of like the way the old masters were able to paint. Still something that's a key of like Flemish painting is the extreme amount of details and how they use objects as symbolism throughout the work. You can see there's an influence for Jan van Eyck here because he's using that convex um, image in order to make a domed image in like a mirror. So Jan van Eyck was one of the first to do that, and we see several artists throughout history trying to replicate that as well. So one work of a Christian content is Goldsmith in a Shop, according to the traditional interpretation. This work is a portrait of Saint Eligius, who was initially a goldsmith before committing his life to God, sitting in his stall, showing an elegantly attired couple with a selection of rings. Dietrich Boots. In The Last Supper, this artist chose a different means of suggesting spatial recession. The painting is a central panel of the altarpiece of the Holy Sacrament. This piece is one of the first to employ linear perspective and a vanishing point to create an illusion of depth. So, here we can see there's a use of perspective. So, if you look at the doors, right, and you look at, what would be the line of the floor, which would be on either edge of the room here, right? So, if you were to continue the lines and, brought them all the way back, it would create what's called a vanishing point. So, basically, it's where you kind of have like a giant X, theoretically, in a painting or a drawing. And the vanishing point is where eventually like the perspective stops. So this is called a 1 point perspective. So this is one of the first artists we're seeing with that. So here, like I mentioned before, if we just kind of go back and forth between the image, these would be kind of like the side walls of the painting. This area would be by where the door is. So that's a linear perspective. So now we're moving on to the Renaissance in Quattrocento Italy. So now we're moving back to Italy again, and we're going to talk about the Medici. This is a cultural phenomenon. By the early Quattrocento, the banker Giovanni de' Medici had established the family fortune. His son Cosimo had become a great patron of art and learning in the broadest sense. His grandson Lorenzo, called Il Magnifico, gathered a galaxy of artists and gifted men in all fields and spent lavishly on buildings, paintings, and sculptures. So one of the first things that Medici commissioned was Sandro Botticelli, which is the Birth of Venus. This is a tempera on canvas. And with the Birth of Venus, Botticelli painted the Birth of Venus for the Medici based on a poem by Angelo Poliziano, a leading humanist of the day. Venus was born of the sea foam, standing on a conch shell at the center of the painting. Zephyrus was the west wind carrying the nymphs that blows Venus into the sacred island of Cyprus. Their nymph Panoma runs to meet her with a broken mantle. Zephyrus's breath moves all the figures without effort, draperies easily in the gentle gusts, perfumed rose petals that fall on the white caps. So, we can see all of that happening here. This is Zephyrus, this is the nymph, and this is Venus in the center. Botticelli would use a model for Venus, which was an ancient similar statue, similar to Aphrodite, by the famous Greek sculptor Praxiteles. The nude, especially female nude, was exceedingly rare during the Middle Ages. The artist's depiction could have drawn harsh criticism, but more accommodating Renaissance culture, under the protection of the powerful Medici, this interpretation went unchallenged. So, because the Medicis were such a powerful group of patrons, they were able to get away with the idea of, nudity such as this, because typically you wouldn't see that kind of thing. So, Renaissance humanism is an important thing that happens during this time period, and it's an emphasis on education and expanding knowledge, the exploration of individual potential and desire to excel, and a commitment to civic responsibility and moral duty. So, one of the first artists we're going to look at is Donatello. This is St. Mark in the niche of the south side of San Michele in Florence, Italy. This was made in 1411 through 1413. It is 7 foot high, 7 foot 9 high. So some of the characteristics that we see of these quattrocentric artists are artists are acquired a way to make a certain and consistent way of making art to solve the problem of representing death in two-dimensional painting or relief. Renaissance artists conceived this picture plane as a transparent window through which the observer looks to see the constructed pictorial world. These artists use perspective as a way to clarify their compositions. Filippo de Brunelleschi used linear perspective, which enables the artist to determine mathematically the relative size of rendered objects to correlate with them visual in reception into space. The artist must first identify a horizontal line that marks the image, the horizon, and the distance, and then the artist selects a vanishing point in the horizon line at the exact center of the line. So, basically, the breakdown of that is, artists can use different mathematical formulas to kind of work on figure, shape, even landscapes as well. So, we see this kind of starting with the way artists are going about different compositions, making different types of perspectives. So they'll use lines to kind of guide their way to creating these. In this case, these are relief works. So this is another image from Donatello. Donatello created bronze works as well as marbles as well. He can also do a lot of painting work, but he's mostly known for his sculptural works. I joke that this section of the class we're going through the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So we have Donatello, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Leonardo. So we start off with Donatello. He's a sculptor who was an apprentice of Ghiberti's workshop. Training in this workshop included studying marble and bronze sculpture as well as painting. Donno's sculptures reference a Greek artist, but introduced this work to be into the Renaissance. So we're going to talk a little bit about painting. We're going to talk about Masaccio. Her soft eyes, the innovative spirit of the 15th century Florentine painting, this artist broke sharply with the normal practice of imitating his master's style, who worked in Gothic mode. He moved suddenly with a short span of 6 years to uncharted territory. Most historians consider no other painter in history to have contributed so much development to a new style. His untimely death at age 27 cut his brilliant career short. He was an artistic descendant of Giotto, whose calm monumental style carried further by introducing a whole new repertoire of representational devices that generations of Renaissance painters later died and developed. So Masaccio, this is, you can tell this one is a fresco because of the lighter pigments in the paintings. So this is the tribute money. So this is basically, when we're seeing tax collectors in the story of Jesus. And with this work, he was known for his work with the Brenacci Chapel. The work was the main church of the Carmel order. Shortly before his death, he depicted an episode from the Gospel of Matthew, where the tax collector confronts Jesus to the entrance of a Roman town. The figures recall Giotto and the simple grandeur, but they convey a greater psychological and physical credibility. The work is innovative because of the use of figures. This is one of the examples where you could see chiaroscuro being used. The term chiaroscuro, this is an Italian term which literally means light dark. In the paintings, in the description, it refers to clear tonal contrasts, which are often used to suggest the volume and modeling of the subjects depicted. So, here we can see some examples of that. We see a lot of, this kind of like intense, like powerful lighting and scenery just to kind of emphasize like the focal points of these different paintings. So here, obviously Christ is the focal point. He's right in the center. He's also like more contrasted to the rest of the work. It's kind of similar how like the altarpieces were made, where you kind of have like a piece of architecture framing it in. So, that's definitely happening here. Here it's done more so with color. We have an image where, Adam and Eve are being cast out by this angel from the Garden of Eden. They're both kind of in anguish. Adam is painted with that dramatic chiaroscuro style. So you can tell he's very heavily emphasized. So is the angel as well. So we're going to go back to Botticelli for a second. We're going to take a look at Primavera. This was made in 1482, and this is a tempera on wood. This is the appeal of Greek and Latin literature to the elite families of the Quattrocento Florence, which is evident, however, in paintings produced by Botticelli for the members of the Medici family in the 1480s. Botticelli painted Primavera for Lorenzo de Profesneco de' Medici, one of Lorenzo the Magnificent's cousins. The artist made reference to his patron by settling the scene in a grove of orange fruit because the name Medici means doctors and fruit, which was befitting symbol of the family. This was painted a couple years before the birth of Venus. The princely courts. The governments, churches, guild, and merchants of the Republic of Florence and Venice were not only sponsors of the rebirth of art in Italy, the princely courts in Rome, Urbino, Mantua, and elsewhere were instrumental in nurturing Renaissance art. Whether the prince was a duke, a count, or a pope, in order to efficiently run the princely court required administrative structure ranging from staff, counts, nobles, cooks, waiters, stewards, footmen, and stable hands. Rome and the Papal States. Although not a secular ruler, the Pope in Rome was the head of the court with an enormous wealth at his disposal. With the election of a French pope in 1305, however, people's commissions in Rome had ceased, and for more than a century, the once glorious city became an artistic backwater. Upon his election in 1471, however, Pope Sixtus IV initiated a major building campaign in Rome that included the restoration of churches, bridges, and streets and aqueducts. So here we're taking a look at a work called Perugino. This is Christ delivering the keys of the kingdom to St. Peter. This is a mural in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Italy. With Perugino, this is a fresco. Christ hands the keys to St. Peter, who stands in the mid-imaginary gathering of 12 apostles and the Renaissance contemporary. These figures occupy the apron of great stage space that extends to the distance of a point of convergence in the doorway and a central planned temple. The smaller figures in the middle enhance the depth and can also act out important New Testament stories. An example is the episode of Jesus and Peter and the tribute money. So now we're going into the Cinquecento. We're going to look at Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo was known for his expressive human figures, both in painting and sculpture. The manifestation of the body in his works truly portrays the soul of each person being depicted. Michelangelo always painted with a sculptor's eye, and he was able to see how light and shadow and volume and surface influenced how a body would look. So here we can see an image of the Sistine Chapel, which these still images don't really do it justice. I have a video to watch on that I highly recommend because it's easier to see the thing in depth, because you have a lot of different arches and whatnot that Michelangelo had to work with in order to create this really stunning imagery. So what is depicted in the Sistine Chapel? It is the creation of Adam, the fall of man, and the Last Judgment, which are the frescoes featured in this massive work. Facts about Michelangelo. He was well known for creating the David piece that can be seen at the Vatican. He had a rivalry with the artist named Raphael. So there's a lot of things are taking place in Milan, Italy, and we're going to take a look at artist Leonardo da Vinci. So we will be returning back to Michelangelo and also talking about Raphael, but we're going to go over another Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was the Renaissance man. He was born in a small town of Vinci near Florence, and he trained in the studio of Andrea del Verrocchio. He was known as the quintessential Renaissance man. This meant he was talented in many aspects. He was a fantastic artist, innovator, architect, and designer. Many notebooks of his were found dealing with botany, geology, geography, map-making, zoology, military engineering, animal lore, anatomy, and aspects of physical science, including hydraulics and mechanics. His scientific investigations made him a better painter. Leonardo worked in Milan, which is the city I showed you in the beginning. He worked for the formal in 1482. The political situation in Florence was uncertain, and Leonardo must have felt this in his particular skills and would have been greater in demand in one of Italy's princely courts. Leonardo gained employment in Milan, citing that he had military and engineering experience at the end, and he noted that he was a painter and sculptor. During the 17 years he was in Milan, he created masterpieces that are the basis of his lofty reputation then and now. So this is Madonna on the Rocks that you can see painted by Leonardo. So one thing that's important with the compositions we see with some of these Renaissance painting is we can take a look that things are kind of in a triangle with these figures. So you have Mary, then you have, these other figures forming here. So this triangular composition is a repeated thing that we see. So something about Leonardo's works is, they're not, they have some brightness in here, but they're more like a muted color palette. A lot of his paintings feel like very calm and serene, but he does use a lot more darks and contrast. So the connection of the figures. This painting features Madonna, Christ Child, and infant John the Baptist, and an angel in the pyramidal grouping, like I just mentioned before. Four figures pray, join, bless these acts and gestures. Although meanings are uncertain, they usually unite the individual's portrait. Leonardo is one of the first artists that we looked at that establishes a very human connection. Gestures create a narrative in itself. So here's a very famous painting by Leonardo da Vinci. This is The Last Supper. It is tempera on gesso, pitch and mastic, and it is 181 inches by 346 inches. So this painting is housed in the refectory of the convent of Santa Maria del Grazie in Milan, Italy. This painting represents the scene of the Last Supper of Jesus with the 12 apostles. It is told in the Gospel of John, specifically the moment after Jesus announces that one of the apostles will betray him. You could see Leonardo's use of storytelling and figures with the strength of grouping of the people in the portrait of the image. Unfortunately, this work is in poor completion. Even after 1999, when a cleaning and restoration project lasting more than 2 decades on this piece, Leonardo used a mix of oil and tempera and applied much of it to create a surface to appear more closely, approximate to an oil painting or a canvas on wood. But because the wall did not absorb the pigment into the fresco technique, the painting began to quickly fade. So it was flaking, so it had a lot of issues as far as conservation was concerned. I also wanted to show some of Da Vinci's sketches, which I think are just really phenomenal. Sometimes I like artist drawings more than their paintings, and I think that, this is where you can kind of see like the inner workings of Da Vinci's mind, where he has all these notes, and, he has all these like extremely well rendered anatomical drawings. He's also very famous for the Mona Lisa, which you can find in the Louvre. It's actually kind of like a smaller work. So this piece, it is Lisa di Antonio Maria Gherardini, which is the wife of Francesco del Giocondo, a wealthy Florentine, hence a Mona contradiction of Madonna, yes, my lady. Lisa the woman was about 25 years old when she posed for Leonardo. This painting departs from the early Renaissance boards of women in significant weights. The mouth forms a gentle smile, and her gaze is directed at the viewer. The Renaissance etiquette dictated that a woman should not look directly into a man's eyes, and the portraits of women before this were generally profile views. Another thing that's really interesting about Da Vinci is in the area near where Moravian University is, we actually have a version of the Da Vinci horse. And this was a bronze piece that's also done over in Italy. So, they were able to do recreation of that and have a Da Vinci horse present in Allentown, Pennsylvania. So this was established in 2002, and it was a really important thing for the city of Allentown and the Baum School of Art. Okay, so the next artist, who's really important, also another one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, was Raphael. He was another one of the old masters who created a significant amount of artwork. Although he only lived to 37 years old, he was born into a small town in Umbria near Urbino. Raphael probably learned the basics of art from his father, Giovanni Santi, a painter connected with the doctoral court of Federico da Monteferro. Raphael soon developed an individual style that came to embody the ideals of the High Renaissance. So Raphael is known to be one of the more soft artists of the Renaissance. His paintings were kind of like more light and airy, so they had a lot more gentleness to them. So you can kind of see that as with the way this image is here. This is Marriage of the Virgin. It is one of Raphael's early works, which he painted for the chapel of St. Joseph in the Church of San Francisco in Cota di Costello, which is southeast of Florence. Raphael's work is one that looks light and vibrant, which draws a comparison to the rather old masters. The figures seem to have a glow about them. Raphael spent more than 4 years in 1504 to 1508 in Florence. There, in his early 20s, he began to modify the Madonna compositions he had employed in Umbria. So, here we can see a couple different versions of that. We're still seeing that triangular composition like we were seeing before when it came to the old masters. So Leonardo employed this composition, and right now we're seeing this with Raphael. So again, you can see a lot more of a softness with the way Raphael paints. A lot of his paintings are kind of like more light and airy. The figures all kind of have more soft expressions. Raphael had a painting commissioned by Julius II. After completing Madonna in the Meadow, Raphael was commissioned by Julius II to paint the Papal apartments of the Artistic Palace of the Vatican. This was the Papal Library. Raphael presented images symbolizing 4 branches of human knowledge and wisdom under the headings of theology, law, poetry, and philosophy. Raphael's philosophy mural, the setting was not a school, but a congregation of great philosophers and scientists of the ancient world. So, here we can see this portrait, or this large commission work done by Raphael. Okay, so we're going to end this PowerPoint here, and we'll pick up for next time.